I was brought up on the Catechism. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, the Catechism was a little red book that you were given when you were in primary school. And gradually, through the years of your time in primary school, you had to learn it by heart. It was a series of questions and answers. You had to learn by heart the question and the corresponding answer. And usually at least once a week, the teacher would go round the class asking the questions, and woe betide you if you got it wrong. Don't do catechism like that these days. But I remember in particular that the first part of the catechism is related to the Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed, of course, is the shorter version of the Creed, the one that you're allowed to say at Mass, but more often than not we say the Constantinopolitan Nicene Creed. Now, we'll say the Apostles' Creed today at Mass because I'm talking about it. And I remember one of the sections of the Catechism about the Creed is broken up into 12 units, the Creed. And one of them was the bit about when Jesus dies and then rises again. And curiously, it talks about how Jesus dies, and then it says he descended to the dead or descended into hell. And then on the third day, rises again. And the curious thing about the Catechism was it didn't go into great detail about the death and the resurrection. The question seemed to be more than anything about this descending into hell, this descending among the dead. I suppose they thought, that's the bit that'll puzzle people. And it explained that, well, it's that time when, how Jesus having died, he has to go and find those people who lived and died before he was born as a baby in Bethlehem. And all those good people who came before him, well, they couldn't go to heaven yet because no one can get to the Father except through Jesus, as he's just said in the Gospel. And people had to wait, they said, until Jesus had died. And he goes into that place, it's called limbo, which just means on the boundary. And they were kind of waiting to get to heaven. And Jesus goes and takes them there. It's a bit mechanical in the sense that it seems to imply that everything is restricted by time in the way we are. And one suspects it's not quite like that when you get onto the plane of eternity. However, it's an interesting image. But the curious thing, as I say, was it said very little about Christ's death and resurrection. And I think our teacher must have felt that it needed a bit more explanation. And she said, well, Jesus died for our sins, died for our forgiveness, and then he rose again. And her explanation of why Jesus rose again was, well, he rose again to prove that he's God. For who else could rise again? That's an interesting idea, and I must admit that's what I grew up with. Jesus rose again to prove that he's God. Now, there's something in that. There's, it's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, except there's a great deal more. The whole point about Jesus rising from the dead is that he is accomplishing his great work. He refers to it in the Gospel. He's showing us the way. He refers to it in the Gospel. That Jesus maps out a path for you and me. He dies, rises from the dead, so that when we die, we too may rise. It's the great work of salvation. Now you might say, well, I know all that. But there's a curious bit at the end of today's gospel. I don't know if you noticed it. Talking about the works that he's doing. He says, truly, truly, I say to you, truly, truly, I mean, it's an emphasis that. He's saying, you really have to listen here. I'm telling you something important. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes in me will also do the works that I do. I suppose you could say, well, we'll die and rise again. We'll follow Jesus, this astonishing path to God that somehow we'll all follow. But then he says, and greater works than these will he do. How is it possible? How is it possible that a believer in Jesus, a disciple, a follower, a person like you and me, how could we do greater works than Jesus Christ? It doesn't seem to make sense. What's he talking about? Well, I suppose God in his infinite power can do anything. And I suppose you might say, although it's wondrous for us that he dies and rises again, I suppose from God's point of view, it's a fairly simple matter. If you're God, you just do it. But for you and me, much more limited. Somehow, he's extending our capacity. Somehow he's saying, you will be able to do things that will astonish you. You will be able to accomplish things that nobody would believe. You will be able to do works that people will just gasp at. Now we might think, how is that possible? And of course it's because he gives us this challenge, he invites us, he underwrites everything we do, he makes it all possible. You know, we live in a very troubled world, you and I, and we're all aware of that. And at times we can feel a bit lost and pushed about by the circumstances of life. And we wonder, what does the future hold for any of us? And at times we can feel we're at the mercy of just circumstance. Jesus says in the gospel, if you really trust in me, if you really believe in me, you will be amazed by what you can achieve. It's a call, it's a challenge. It's an indication that things that we would say, that's just too much for me. That's just impossible. You can't expect me to do that. He can. And he says to us, you will be astonished. You will do greater works than you ever imagined. This passage from St. John is wonderful for all kinds of reasons. But I think in particular, it is an encouragement that we can amaze ourselves, amaze the world.